Okay. I'm sorry that we have a shorter lunch time, but I think it was worth it after hearing about all that malnutrition and the fact that your microbiota will determine whether you're going to be malnourished and whatever. It's good that you're all back because we have an important panel to proceed with. And we because of the concentrated time, and we have added a speaker at the last minute, and so I'm going to have very abbreviated comments myself, and then I will turn it over to the panel. You all are aware that, of course, the Affordable Care Act was enacted in 2010, and it was launched a couple of years later in a sort of stuttering way, but it got going, and it's going quite well in the terms of some people, not so well in others. What was it based on? It was based on the need. The need was 42 million people 42 million Americans who are not insured, that their health in this country, if you look at longevity compared with other OECD countries, we are well down the line. We're number 26 out of 36. If you look at the expenditures for health care, they're significantly more. It's 17% of the GDP, which is the highest anywhere in the world, in spite of the fact that we do not have the best health care, the health image in the world, and the fact that we put so little money into prevention. And so that's what this was all based on, the ACA, and it was put together with the idea of covering the uninsured at some point, and the target is not 42 million, but something less than that, but getting as close to total insurance for people, which is important, improving the quality of health care, reducing costs, and do it in a way that's equitable and affordable. And so this is what it was all about. Now, the things that were put together at that time, and you're going to hear about that, are individual and company mandates. People would have to do things to get insurance. There would be subsidies to individuals so they could afford it, and to certain businesses, and so there would be insurance, excuse me, marketplaces, and so we were going to have availability of insurance for everyone in various types. And so where are we today? What has been accomplished since this was launched, and it has become it has remained extremely political. Clearly, when it was passed by Obama, I think, and I think rightfully, sees this as his greatest accomplishment, perhaps during his presidency. Others, the Republicans, there were no Republicans who were supportive at the start, and a majority, I would say now, are opposed to it even now, even though it seems to be there. And so we have a panel that is expert in all of these areas, including the person who was involved in putting the damn thing together, and that's Nancy Ann. So let me tell you just a word. Nancy Ann DeParle is a lawyer from Harvard who has gone into policy from early on, and she's worked in many offices, the OMB, she's worked as advisors to many people, but she was the chief of staff, deputy chief of staff in the office of the White House, and actually put together the Affordable Care Act, and then shepherded it as it was launched. So there's no one who knows more about what is in that act than Nancy Ann, and I'm delighted she's here. Next to her is Peter Bach, who just flew in from Dubai. We spoke at noon yesterday, and he was in Dubai. And I said, "Why are you calling?" He said, "Well, I'm going to be on your panel." I said, "No, you're not, because you told me you weren't going to be there, so we got somebody else." And he said, "But I'm going to be there." I said, "Fine, come." So that's why we have that. That's why Peter's here. Ken Frazier is chairman and CEO of Merck, and he is also a trained lawyer, started as a lawyer, was in a law firm when he was recruited to Merck and came in as a general counsel of a part of Merck, a joint venture, and then was brought eventually into the company, became the general counsel, and ultimately, on the basis of his performance, at learning all the business, went through all the business parts of the company late in his career, and then became CEO and chairman, which he's done for about 4 years, I believe. Next in the line is Jack. Jack Rowe, I know. He's at Columbia. He's very unusual because he's a trained physician who became a geriatrician and headed up geriatrics at Harvard, and then went into various things. He went to Mount Sinai School of Medicine as the king of some sort, and ran the medical school, the hospital, and he tried to put various things together. He was there for, and so he's run geriatrics. He has been a dean type person, but he's run a medical center, and then he went from that to Aetna. So he's then on the insurance side. He was CEO and chairman of Aetna, which is health insurance, and now he lost that job too. He's back at Columbia. He came back to Columbia. He's in the Mailman School of Public Health, where he's a professor, and what's he concentrating on? Health policy, of course, geriatrics on the side, and a friend also, and then wait a minute. Okay, then we have Jonathan Sheldon, who's a PhD. He's a molecular biologist and biochemist, perfect for this panel, and he is a global vice president, Oracle Health Sciences, and he's clearly gone into understanding healthcare and advising people in that era. And he is global vice president of the healthcare part of Oracle. So welcome, Jonathan. And finally, Glenn Steele is another extraordinary person. I cannot believe this is one guy who's done so many things. Looking at him, you would not guess that he's a surgeon, but that's what he is. He went to Harvard undergrad, and then he went to medical school. Where? Harvard. Can't read these damn things. NYU. Thank you, NYU. And then he went to Lund University for a PhD, and came back in surgery. Became professor of surgery and chairman of some department in Boston, and then he went from there to Geisinger. Is that? Oh, no, he went to the University of Chicago School of Medicine, where he was dean of a medical school, and the Pritzker School, and then went from there to the Geisinger Clinic. A strange thing for going from surgery, cancer surgery, to running a health system, but he was very unusual that he jumped into genetics of disease and understanding, getting into precision medicine, well ahead of the crowd, I would say, and has developed systems for making his healthcare system more efficient and lower cost. And so now he has spun out, as I understand it, Glenn, spun out from Geisinger with Geisinger information that was developed under his leadership to start a company together with Geisinger to this XG thing that he has now, which he is chairman of, and he's going to tell other people how they did it at Geisinger, if I understand this correctly. And so I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll take questions at the end. I'd like everybody to get their 2 cents in before we open it to the floor, but we will do it, and we'll take as much time as we need. So let's go. Let's begin. Nancy Ann, you can start up here.
Oh, okay. I'll kick it off from here. Is that all right?
Okay, sure.
Thanks, Roy. And you gave a bit of the prelude to what I was going to say, so I can keep mine a little bit shorter. We're almost 6 years in now to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, so it's a good time, I think, to take stock of where we are. And you have to start where we started in 2009, and where were we? And Roy's given some of that backdrop. You said 42 million, Roy. The number I remember was 51 million uninsured Americans, a number that was projected to grow every year as costs kept rising. The high costs and the rate of cost growth, outstripping for decades our growth in GDP, and it was threatening government budgets as well as businesses, and more people were being dropped every year by their employers. Those of us who were lucky enough to have employer-sponsored coverage were seeing huge increases. I think it had doubled over a decade. And at the same time, as Roy underscored, despite spending more than every other industrialized country on health care, our return on investment was embarrassing. We were not getting the bang for the buck that we should be getting. So those were the problems that really President Obama decided to take on in 2009. And when I went to the White House, I had a list of the top 10 problems in health care. I don't have it in front of me today, but I dare say that if I showed it to you, the knowledgeable people, including everyone in this room, would pretty much agree on what the problems were. So it was a pretty daunting list. So we tried to do three main things through the Affordable Care Act. One was to get everyone covered, and I think on that one I'd say, yes, that has been successful. Whatever your source of truth is, whether it's Gallup or the Congressional Budget Office, whoever you look at, everyone agrees that the numbers are such that we've seen at least 25 million people who are getting coverage through either the state or federal marketplaces or through Medicaid. About 18 million of those people were uninsured before. And I think even more remarkable in some ways than the increases in coverage are the transformation and the total change in the rules of the road for insurance in this country, which benefits not just the people who have gained insurance who didn't have it, but everyone in this room who has either employer-sponsored coverage or was buying in these marketplaces. You now have certain guarantees around minimum essential benefits, including prescription drug coverage. You now have reformed insurance markets that can't deny you coverage because of pre-existing conditions, which used to routinely be the case in many states. You now cannot be discriminated against on the basis of your gender in getting insurance. Age discrimination is more limited. Rating based on age is more limited. And there are no longer lifetime and annual limits on your coverage. And these are the things that you used to read about that would leave people bankrupt. So I think those things are remarkable. And I have to say, for that much change to have occurred as quickly as it did, because it started right after the law passed in March of 2010, is a pretty remarkable thing in this country. So the second thing that we sought to do was to bring down the rate of healthcare cost growth. And while it is certainly the case that the Great Recession and some of the structural changes that were beginning to occur even before the Affordable Care Act was enacted, such as more high deductible plans and more skin in the game on the part of consumers, those had an impact. But I think 6 years into this slow-ish recovery, most economists would agree that some of the structural changes that we made in the Affordable Care Act have also been a major contributor to the lowest rate of healthcare cost growth in about 50 years. So there I would say, yes, again, there's been some success so far in bringing down the rate of healthcare cost growth. Whether that is sustainable is another question. It was a very delicate balance between, some say we didn't do enough to control healthcare costs, especially on prescription drugs. I will tell you that we considered and put everything into the law that we could get a consensus on, both from economists and healthcare policy experts and from members of Congress. There's, hundreds of pages of changes, structural changes to Medicare reimbursement in the law. We did everything we knew how to do to help bring down the rate of cost growth. I think some of it's beginning to have an impact. But even so, some of the things that we did that, for example, Jack, I know you were with Sherry Gleed earlier today, an economist. All the economists agree you need to do more on the demand side of healthcare. And in fact, they said unless you include something along the lines of the so-called tax exclusion policy to remove healthcare from this preferential treatment with respect to employers and employees not paying taxes on what is really income, we won't think that this is really going to have an impact on long-term cost growth. So after lots of negotiations, the high-cost health plan tax was included, which taxes a portion of plans that are above a certain pretty high threshold starting a couple years from now. It was very difficult to get that into the law, and now that's one of the main things that people want to overturn. Now, economists tell you this is essential to help long-term control the healthcare cost growth. But one man's way of containing healthcare cost growth is another man's income or health benefits that they really like. And so that basic tension that we have hasn't been totally resolved. The third thing that we were trying to do is to reform the delivery system, to try to move our healthcare delivery system away from fee-for-service payment that tends to incentivize more services towards fee-for-value that would tend to reward outcomes that we're looking for and would tend to be more efficient. Many of the delivery system reforms that I alluded to earlier were in that category of trying to do those things, whether it's accountable care organizations or more bundling, trying to create more incentives to deliver the right care to the right patient at the right time. I think the jury is still out there, but I would argue that we are beginning to see some progress from some of those delivery system reforms. And the problem for the next president and the next administration will be how do we figure out which ones are working, bring them to scale, and the ones that aren't working, either discard them or fix them. And then how do we double down on finding the next wave of innovations that will help us to lower costs. And that's, I think, a good place to end my comments.
Thank you. Okay, Peter.
Yes, thanks, Roy, and thanks for letting me crash this panel. So I've been focused on a number of sort of, I think, are inefficient breaks or problems in the market in healthcare. Much of what Nancy Ann said resonates with some of the work I've been focused on for years. But I have more recently started to focus on the issue of the high price of drugs, and actually not just the high price, but the breaks in the market and the sort of disjointedness with which we see between pricing and any measures of value of drugs, or such as efficacy. So I want to sort of lay out a picture, if I can, and I certainly won't take my 10 minutes. But it strikes me that what we mostly see is, in terms of drug pricing in the U.S., is that manufacturers can pick their prices in many areas, particularly in the protected classes, in oncology where I focus. And that's due to a collection of laws and regulations that make Medicare and a lot of other payers mandatory buyers. Once you have a mandatory buyer, you have no restriction in pricing. And we maintain a graph on the Sloan Kettering website in my research group that shows that introductory prices for cancer drugs since the dawn of Medicare in '65, normalized to a month of therapy, have gone up 100-fold after the adjusting for inflation. And we recently had a paper showing that if you think about a drug, and pardon me for sounding dispassionate, but if you think about a drug buying life years, the cost of a life year in today's dollars for a drug approved in the 90s was about $50,000, and a life year for a drug approved nowadays is about $250,000. So there's this sense, in fact, there's a quantitative evidence that we're sort of falling behind as we make progress. And that's not just the case, by the way, for drugs for cancer. The new PCSK9 inhibitors, it costs about $18 a month to get a 1 milligram reduction in LDL. In the original statins at their branded price, it cost about $1.80. So it's a 10-fold increase in the price of reducing LDL by a milligram. In other words, sort of slipping behind with progress. So that isn't sustainable. And it's not sustainable because we actually have an infinite journey to complete. We want to continue to reduce the death rate from cancer and tackle other diseases. And if we are always moving on a margin and paying incrementally more, 10 times as much more, 100 times as much, if you will, we will run out of money before we get where we need to go. So we actually need more efficiency. And what's happened is Nancy Ann's absolutely right that the rate of healthcare cost inflation has slowed, and the Affordable Care Act obviously deserves some credit for it. But actually, if you carve out drugs, the picture looks much better for all other areas of healthcare spending. Last year, the rate of rise of all other healthcare together was about 4.9%. For drugs, it was somewhere between 12.5% and 13.5%. Historically high for drugs, no end in sight. And the reason for that is new branded drugs in the specialty category are now targeting large populations, not small ones. The rate of turnover into the generic market has slowed. Many of these drugs are biosimilars, which take longer, we're seeing, to become sort of genericized, if you will, or biologic drugs. And we also see generic price hikes, that some of which have made the news, obviously, with various pharma bros raising their prices. So there's only one pharma bro, pardon me. And obviously, yes, sorry, I didn't mean to upset. Fair enough. But no, that's a cartoon version, but it's actually an extract of industry behavior brought into light by this sort of very simple example. So this is probably where we need to go. The most important thing to worry about, the thing to optimize, is the rate of innovation. And there's no question of that. But innovation fails when access fails, if the innovation cycle doesn't close. And one of the things we see strongly here is with price rises, insurance structures that include co-insurance price people out of drugs. So we see patients not getting their Gleevec in the U.S. because of co-insurance, which is proportional, of course, to the drug's price. And we see other sorts of breaks in the system. And then we see, and so one of the things we probably need to do is to start pricing drugs based on their value, their core attributes. So drugs that work really well should cost more than drugs that don't. Drugs that reflect a breakthrough in science should cost more because there's a reward for that. There's a reward, I think, for making a new immunotherapy as opposed to the fifth ALK inhibitor. That it was riskier when it was taken on. It was unclear how it would all work out, but it was riskier than it was to sort of make a, and I don't want to use the term me too, but make a derivative scientific breakthrough. And within that, we need something that I described. It's a European idea, but I never say that because then it's bad. But brought it here, rebranded it as if it were American, indication-specific pricing, which is this idea that a drug shouldn't be thought of anymore as a pill or something in a bottle, but simply based on, it should be thought of in terms of who it's used on. Because in some populations of patients there are large benefits per dose, and other populations there are small benefits. We want both kinds of benefits, but we don't want to pay the same price, or it's illogical to pay the same price. So indication-specific pricing is a piece of any sort of value-based approach. And then the last thing is we do need to keep thinking about getting the prescribers out of the business of choosing which drugs to use. And it's because it cuts both ways. And I'm actually less concerned. We have a long history, decades of research showing that docs will lean towards more expensive drugs when they make larger profits, when they have choice. And we've recently seen in the 340B program, which I'll come back to, that this effect is larger. But the real problem is that you create these different financial entities where some have huge purchasing power and discounts like 340B, others don't. And so we're having sort of a collapse of the delivery system as a result. And so if we want to have indication-specific pricing, have value-based pricing, the last piece is get expensive drugs off the balance sheets, if you will, of practicing docs and go back to a centralized distribution model like the competitive acquisition program. So anyway, thanks very much.
Thanks, Peter.
So let me start by saying that Peter and I share a lot of thematic resonance here. We also are concerned about the rising cost of healthcare. We're also very much along the lines of let's price all therapies, all interventions based on the real value that they create in the real world. So starting with the rising cost of healthcare, we all should be concerned about that, especially, I think, with respect to the burden that places on patients, particularly that with respect to copays. And we see in our business the negative impact of copays for prescriptions. I would make one amendment when you say they're proportional. The reality of the world is if you look at the percentage copays for drugs, hospitals, and physicians, drug copays are significantly larger. They're on average around 24% versus something like 6% for hospitals and 3% for physicians. So there is an issue around the pricing of drugs, but the burden on the individual patient is largely also a result of the design of the benefits. Having said that, I also think that we have to recognize that a lot of what is pushing the burden of rising health care costs is the burden of chronic diseases. We saw in today's New York Times an article about Alzheimer's disease. For Medicare, Alzheimer's disease is significantly more expensive per patient than cancer or heart disease. It's about $300,000 per patient. You think that's bad? Here, a little bit of data, okay? Because I think it perfectly illustrates the rising costs of chronic disease. Today, as I said, it's $300,000 per patient. By 2050, the number of people who have Alzheimer's in our society will triple to 14 million patients. The cost per patient will increase 5 times. So right now our country's paying about $225 billion a year for Alzheimer's. In 2050, it will be $1.1 trillion. My company is in late-stage testing right now for an Alzheimer's medicine, and people should know this is not an easy area because the industry has already spent hundreds of billions of dollars in the area, 99% failure rate. But the reality of the world is this country will be bankrupted if we don't get a disease-modifying agent for Alzheimer's. So that's one of the most important things. As it relates to the impact of drugs, in 1960, drugs were, and Nancy Ann will know this, 10% of aggregate healthcare costs. Today, drugs are 10% of aggregate healthcare costs. Now, in fact, you can look at the rising cost of branded drugs because, in fact, there have been some branded drugs that I would agree actually don't demonstrate the value commensurate with the cost, so we're not disagreeing on that. But there's another issue that I think people forget about with respect to drugs. That is to say, the innovations, the inventions in the industry that I represent are the only healthcare interventions which over time go down in price and go down significantly. Because we actually have, in essence, about 10 years of market exclusivity. Then the drugs that we invent are available for pennies. And that's our legacy to the healthcare system. In fact, if you look at the volume prescriptions, something like 85% of all prescriptions in the United States are generics. I think of that as the industry's contribution to what you're trying to do over the long term, Nancy Ann, because those drugs are available. Now, having said all of that, the reality of the world is, coming back to the point that was made a few minutes ago, not all drugs are priced based on the value. And I want to clearly and publicly disassociate the innovative pharmaceutical industry from what you call the pharma bro. The reality of the world is our industry isn't at all homogeneous. A company like Merck spends over $7 billion a year in R&D, hoping to come up with a drug like Keytruda, which we think is a huge breakthrough. And by the way, with respect to pricing, we priced it at the exact cost of the predecessor drug, although in melanoma we're about 4 times more effective with much less toxicity. That's what we call value pricing inside Merck. But at the same time, we are facing the fact that increasingly the diseases that we are going after have been the most intractable diseases. We're asking people to put capital up for long periods of time to go after diseases like Alzheimer's, which have evaded cure and have evaded useful treatments. So I think going forward, I think we actually have a lot more in common than we're different. I think at the end of the day, one of the things that is true about pharma pricing is that our costs are very transparent. So people can look at the list price of a pharmaceutical drug and they can say, oh, that's a lot of money. And you do get a reaction to the sticker price. I mean, you know, in reality, of course, the discounts that are provided in the marketplace are very different from the prices that you see. People don't tend to pay the sticker price for cars. They don't also tend to pay the sticker prices for our medicines. So I think it's important to recognize a few things that are true about our industry. First of all, I agree that we should price based on value. Secondly, we are the ones that are actually trying to come up with innovations for these things like Alzheimer's that are frankly going to bankrupt our system. The third thing is we have a limited window to make back the capital invested in R&D. And if we don't make it back in that window, then we can't make it back at all. And that's why you're seeing consolidation of drug companies, because despite the fact that people view it as a very profitable business, what you're really seeing is that many companies can't make a go of it because they're actually, we only have that 15% of the market left over. So I would just close my comments by saying it's important to focus on the price of all of health care. I think it's important to make sure that we are providing health care that provides both access and better outcomes to patients. But the best way is for all of us to work together and to look at the value of all these interventions, hospitalizations, drugs, devices, etc., and to actually have value-based pricing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Jack?
Well, Roy, thanks very much for including me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about health insurance and try to provide a little bit of context for what the impact of the ACA has been on health insurance in the United States, and in that context talk a little bit about the consolidations that are currently underway, as that's an area of major interest. To start with, it's important to understand the pre-ACA condition of health insurance companies, for-profit ones at least. They had a pre-tax operating profit of around 5%. A high-functioning company may be 6%. Now, some of you in pharma industry, that doesn't sound like very much, but it was at Aetna 6% of $50 billion. So it is, in fact, a lot of dollars. And the PE ratios, the price-to-earning ratios, for shares of publicly traded health insurance companies are in the 12 to 14 range. This is not 25, it's not infinity, it's 12 to 14. It gives you an idea of what kinds of companies these are. So in that context, there was a lot of concern that the Affordable Care Act was going to kill private health insurance in the United States. And it was going to kill it because these narrow margins were going to get compressed by a whole variety of things. There were going to be restrictions on the previous restrictions on pre-existing conditions were going to be removed. Lifetime limits on health insurance benefits were going to be removed. I never understood why there should be a lifetime limit to begin with. I mean, if somebody, the very people who would be using a lot of health insurance benefits are the ones who need it, right? Why would you say, oh, well, as of next Thursday, you're no longer eligible? Well, that didn't make any sense. In addition, there were annual, and it wasn't really clear to me why the industry kind of defended these stupid things, because it just made them look bad. There were annual limits also. What sense did that make? So they got rid of those. There's a medical loss ratio minimum that was put in place. That was sure to kill the industry. There were increased reviews, premium increases. That was sure to kill the industry. And then there were new taxes that were placed, thank you, Nancy Ann, on the industry. And that was really sure to kill the industry because of the narrow margins. And so with those considerations in mind, as you're all aware, the industry has done very, very well under the Affordable Care Act. Well, why is that? Well, the industry has done very well because some of these things that were removed were stupid and really de minimis to begin with, and also because, as has been mentioned twice already, the rate of rise of healthcare costs has declined progressively over the last 4 to 5 years. And some of that is directly related to the ACA, although it's primarily about access, and it did have beneficial effects there, and some of it is unrelated to the ACA. The market changes. But the point is that people price insurance based on their best actuarial guess of what the rate of rise in healthcare expenditure is going to be for the next year, and each year for the last 5 years, that estimate has been high, which means there have been increased profits for the health insurance industry, which overwhelmed all these other considerations. So the stocks have never been higher, and the companies have a fair amount of cash, which just tells you that you can never, nobody really ever knows what's going to happen about anything. The second thing was that it was said that the exchanges are surely going to fail because, first of all, no insurance companies are going to show up. Wrong. There were a lot of, in fact, new provider-sponsored insurance companies that showed up, and after a year of seeing that the thing was actually working, a bunch of the mainframe insurance companies have increasingly showed up in different markets. But in addition, it was said that only healthy young people are going to show up, and you're going to have adverse selection and a death spiral. And that was the way it looked until about 4 days before the closing of open enrollment, and then all these normal middle-aged and older people showed up, and things got a lot better. Or mirabile dictu kind of thing all of a sudden. And everybody said, well, we knew that was going to happen. But, and the third thing that was supposed to happen was employers were supposed to send all of their employees to the exchanges, which they didn't do. Hardly any of them did. So none of those predictions were right. And the exchanges are doing fine. Now, why are we having these consolidations if everything is so fine? Well, you know, the insurance companies have to, this may not be something that any of you ever want to do for more than 5 minutes of your life, but put yourself in the boardroom of an insurance company. There are 13 people on the board. Some of those people are saying, you know, we're a regulated utility. We got all these taxes, all these restrictions. Healthcare costs aren't going to go down forever. We're going to be in trouble. And our stock price has never been higher. And if we sell, we're going to get a 20% premium on that. And so when am I going to see that number again? What's the likelihood I'm going to see it? All in favor. And 6 people raise their hand. Then somebody else says, you know, the only way we're going to make it, since we are now a regulated utility, is to get more scale. We have to get bigger and get more efficient in each of our lines of business, Medicare, Medicaid, commercial. We just need to scale up. Our stock price has never been higher. We've got all this cash because of these prior period reserve developments because of lower health care costs. We've got a lot of power here on the balance sheet. Let's buy something and get bigger. And 6 people raise their hand. Okay. And then when that 13th person gets off his or her cell phone and decides which of these 2 arguments they like, then you know whether that company is a seller or a buyer, all right? And that's basically the situation as I see it. Now, I'm imagining that, conjuring this up. I haven't been in any of these conversations, but I think it's quite reasonable, you know? And what happened is recently was that certain companies were both sellers and buyers simultaneously, depending on who was showing up on the conference call or the board meeting and what kind of offers were going on. And but that is, I think, what's going on in the industry. Now, so what? Is this good or bad for America? Okay? What happens when health insurance companies consolidate? Well, you know, are they going to be approved? Are they going to get away with this? Particularly 2 big deals at the same time. And, you know, the liberals are swooning at the prospect, and the hospitals are hating it, and the American Medical Association, in case if you don't know, that is a large union of physicians based in Chicago. They're swooning about it. You know, there's actually, and this gets very uncomfortable for a conversation with hospitals and doctors and insurance companies, because there's actually evidence on this. So you can actually, you know, there's actually data on this. So what happens is when an insurance market is hyper-concentrated, those insurance companies that are in it, or the insurance company in it, such as, you know, Rochester, New York, where Excellus, the Blue Cross plan, has 86% of the market, they get better prices from providers. Go figure, right? The question is whether they pass those better prices on to their customers. And that depends on whether there's enough competition in the insurance market on the other side for there to be other insurance companies bidding for those customers or not. And if there isn't, then they don't pass it along. And if there is, they do. The government, the Federal Trade Commission, conducts a very, very robust, market-based review, kind of county by county, of the effect of a consolidation. And what they will do is they will go to two companies that are trying to merge, and they will say to them, you have to get rid of these two counties in eastern Tennessee and this county in Missouri and these two counties in Montana, because after you merge, it's going to be anti-competitive in those counties. And they will take them out of the merger. The investment banking team who put the merger together is populated by people who used to work at the Federal Trade Commission. They know the equation, and they have already done that analysis, and they have already told the board, this is the accretion of this deal after you are forced to divest anywhere between 5 and 15 of these counties. And this is what it looks like. And so it's not going to be a shock to anybody. And sometimes they have to divest fewer, and sometimes they have to divest more, but this is knowable. So it's very likely, in my mind, not having any specific information about any specific market, that these things are going to get accepted after some divestiture, which is not going to be much of a surprise to anybody, but in fact, you never know. Whether or not it will be good for consumers and for employers, it's entirely dependent upon the individual market, and it will be very different in some markets than other markets, depending on not only how many other insurers, but the last point is how many other providers. Because once in a while in healthcare you get into what's called dual monopolies. You get a very large insurance company owns the market, and a very, very large provider owns the market. There might be one of those in Baltimore, for instance. Rural Pennsylvania, there might be one of those. What happens when a monopolistic situation develops on both sides? And what actually seems to happen is that neither side takes full advantage. It's very interesting. The insurance company does not gouge the provider because they know they're dependent on good relations with that provider over the long haul, because the patients want to go to Johns Hopkins or Geisinger or whatever, and they trust it. And the providers don't gouge the insurance company too much. They get much more than Medicare payments, but they don't overdo it because they want the insurance company to be there, because they don't want the insurance company to fail and have increased numbers of uninsured patients. So that's my perspective on what's going to happen going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Jonathan Sheldon.
Thanks, Roy. So I wanted to give really our experiences working with many of the leading life science and healthcare organisations, many of which are in this room. And there's really 4 points I wanted to cover. Value-based care and what that means from a healthcare perspective. The role of healthcare analytics and population health management strategies in that context. Value-based care from a pharma perspective, and then time permitting, I wanted to talk a little bit about precision medicine. So as Nancy Ann mentioned, thanks to ACA at a macro level, we're starting to see a shift from fee-for-service, fee-for-value, value-based reimbursement, driven largely by the fact that we have a business case for it now. So CMS spent over $500 billion in 2013, plan to shift about 50% of that to value-based care by 2018. Commercial payers spend just over $900 billion, plans apparently to move 75% of that to value-based care by 2020. And here in New York, $6 billion invested in the delivery system reform incentive program, Medicaid specific, but aiming to reduce hospital care by 25% in the next 5 years. So as we all know, under the traditional fee-for-service model, providers are reimbursed based on the units of care that they deliver, which incentivizes them to deliver more care, so more tests, more admissions, more procedures, rather than focus on the quality of care. And with the new regulatory requirements, that providers are increasingly shifting risk. The payers are increasingly shifting that risk back to providers. And with the novel mandated Medicare regulations, what we're starting to see is incentives and penalties for quality reporting, e-prescribing, lower reimbursement rates for excessively high readmission rates and hospital-acquired conditions. So as Nancy Ann mentioned, I mean, in parallel, we're starting to see the emergence of the ACO delivery model. I think we're at about 700 now. So that's growing at about 200 every year, which I think is encouraging. Clearly, it's still being worked out, and the issues over whether you incentivize improved performance versus financial savings is still working on the levers. But from a technology perspective, that's a very challenging area, and we really need to keep pace with that changing care delivery model. So the point I really wanted to make about that is so much of being able to make informed decisions driven on data comes down to healthcare analytics. And I think, as we all know, healthcare has lagged behind many other industries in its use of analytics, which is why, well, one reason why for many organisations their first step in the use of analytics is just trying to understand the true cost of care, which, you think about it, really is such a key business fundamental. It's rather incredible that it's almost its own science. But the reality is, to establish that true cost of care is complicated. It requires you to aggregate and clean large amounts of EMR data, claims data, self-reported patient data, remote patient monitoring, genomics, imaging. It just goes on and on. But what I do think is this downside, this risk to downside, is going to jumpstart many organisations' use of analytics, and that's a difficult road to take. You need bottom-up, top-down support, because it can be disruptive. It highlights things like poor performance, and of course, analytics is only part of that process. It needs to go hand in hand with change management and process improvements, and really empowering the patient and the physician. And the reality is, effective care is underused because our health system lacks a means of supporting systematic compliance. What I mean by that is really integrating evidence-based guidelines with case management and EHRs and physician behaviour. And analytics is just part of a bigger process, which involves obviously the people to that. So the other point I really wanted to make about that is, population health is clearly exploding in the healthcare sector. So many providers are now all about population health, and we're still trying to figure out the necessary steps to achieve that. Really, how you stratify patients based on clinical and financial risk, and then based on that risk, how you coordinate care across the care continuum, and how you engage the patient to be an active participant in that. Just to say briefly about sort of value-based care from a pharma perspective, obviously it represents a major change in the sort of pharma business model, as Ken mentioned, in terms of being more focused on outcomes and I guess less on tablets. And for years, farmers competed based on medical differentiation of its product and the sophistication of its sales and marketing force, where regulatory approval was about showing efficacy and safety and an unmet medical need. And clearly things are now shifting, where payers are asking for cost effectiveness and comparative effectiveness research based on real-world data. And again, that's really tough. From an analytics perspective, we're still very immature in our use of analytics on real-world data and integrating that with clinical trials. But the stakes are high. I mean, failure to meet those criteria results in lower reimbursement and in some cases exclusion from a payer's benefit package. I do think there are a number of challenges for pharma in that perspective, really, in that there's a kind of strategic challenge in terms of understanding where pharma want to play in that treatment ecosystem, in terms of what are the services and the products they want to provide, and how do they want to structure those, and then also what kind of partnerships do they want to form around that. I mean, one thing's very clear, I think, in that as the treatment ecosystem evolves, there's a number of different inputs in that. So the drugs, the diagnostics, the medical technologies, the care delivery, the care management, and who's going to orchestrate all those pieces in that. Maybe it's the providers, maybe it's the payers, maybe it's the pharma. It's certainly going to require some meaty IT underpinning it, and that's why I think IT vendors like Oracle have a key role to play in helping to aggregate all that data. And then maybe just to finish off, I wanted to say a thing or two about the precision medicine area. So, really an area that's exploded over the last few years, particularly the last 2 or 3 years, as it's kind of translated from being basically one big research experiment to one more focused on actually impacting clinical care. And I think really for the first time this year we can actually start to reference studies that do show an improved outcome and they do reduce cost, which is really long overdue. And it goes back to my earlier point, the reason those studies don't exist is actually those kinds of analytics are difficult and require a lot of aggregation of data. But we're starting to see lots of studies now that point to that improved outcome at reduced cost. I mean, since this is a panel on regulatory reform, obviously with President Obama announcing the Precision Medicine Initiative and the State of the Union, it's worth just flagging there are a number of, I think, areas of focus that are going to be needed to make that initiative a success. So, privacy. So, I think it really is an opportunity to rethink privacy under HIPAA and a slew of state and federal regulations. It's the large sort of genomic studies that we need that are going to be critical for the Precision Medicine Initiative to be a success. It's very difficult to do those studies under those kinds of regulations. We do need to rethink, I think, sort of more pliable privacy standards to achieve that. And then my second point actually would be around interoperability. So we're still struggling with that, and I think we need to look at the ways that we might want to approach interoperability and use the Precision Medicine Initiative as a way to sort of reboot the system so we can share all this real-world data. And I guess my point, just to finish off, clearly the health sciences ecosystems are evolving at quite a rate, as are the roles of the major constituents in that system. And I do think data is going to be critical in helping to shape which organisations are well placed to succeed.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, we've heard about the building of the program by Nancy Ann, and then we proceeded to a discussion of pricing of drugs and the efficacy of drugs and how to do it. And then we talked about insurance, and then we talked about from the point of view of a consultant. So we're now down to Glenn Steele, who was running a health system which had to deal with every one of these. Glenn.
Oh, thanks very much, Roy. So, ACA was really a fascinating exercise, and Geisinger was looked at as a one potential model for how this could be transacted. I actually had only one liberal on my board, Karen Davis, which is probably why I'm not CEO there. No, I'm just kidding. We had 15 years at a very interesting time where we actually had we created a truly vertically integrated payer provider in a market that was extraordinarily large and very stable. And as Jack mentioned, we were one of those unusual markets where we had high penetration, high market share on both the provider and the payer side. And we were not like Kaiser. We didn't exclude other payers. We were not like Kaiser. We didn't exclude non-employed physicians. So we were pretty heterogeneous. But the sweet spot of our innovation was between the patients we took care of and the patients that we actually insured. And that sweet spot allowed us to do a huge amount of interaction, both in terms of data analytics as well as feedback that attack total cost of care. So here's where I think a huge amount of innovation in the future, particularly of interest to this group, and the change in the structure and the function of payer-provider is intriguing. I think the greatest value that can be unlocked in healthcare is not based on price per unit. We've had a huge amount of discussion here about various leveraging on price per unit. And obviously, a good case could be made that for many aspects of what becomes stakeholder involvement, particularly in our country, that price per unit is a problem. But what we focused on at Geisinger were a number of units. And we were convinced that there was a huge amount of unindicated or ambiguously indicated work that was done, whether it was on the diagnostic side or whether it was on the therapeutic side. And we've now, I think, shown in a very sustainable way over a period of almost 12 or 13 of my 15 years there, that when chronic disease is managed extraordinarily well, when the introduction of high-cost but highly effective biologicals is done in a way that's very different than has happened over the years in the more fragmented delivery and payer system, that 25 to 30% of hospitalizations can be extracted and sustainably extracted. That's both hospitalizations and rehospitalizations. We believe that the business model for insurance companies, certainly vertically integrated insurance companies like ours, and perhaps even biggies like Jack ran, will change from underwriting to actually working with providers in a variety of different ways to fundamentally improve outcome for patients with multiple chronic diseases, or fundamentally improve outcome for patients who present with back pain, or fundamentally improve outcome for patients who are thinking or are being exposed to high-priced biologicals. And we do believe that value, which I think is up to 35 to 40% of the cost right now baked into healthcare, can be repurposed. Now, how that value is repurposed is a political issue. It's not for us to decide. How that value is repurposed is a market dynamic issue, not for us to decide. But we think that if you represent 1/6 of the economy, and 35% of the costs do not actually help those that we are responsible to and for, both on the payer and the provider side, the ability to extract some of that, unlock some of that, and then redeploy it is really the key. And that's what we were all about at Geisinger. And we showed, in fact, that it was a sustainable business model. Now, there are other good things that happened to us. MMA was a good thing. Something called hierarchical care categorization was a good thing, Jack. But we also extracted a huge amount of that 30 to 35% of unnecessary stuff and redeployed it. Some of it had to be given back to our clients on the payer side, because we were competing with much bigger insurance entities, and we had to extract the value and lower the premiums in order to maintain the small and the mid-sized businesses against a number of bigger. But some of it was used to build our programs. Some of it was used to do the innovation and accept a 15 to 20% failure rate for our innovation. So I think the real question in the future, which is what I'm pursuing right now, is how much of all of that is specific to Shangri-La, which is, Geisinger in the middle of nowhere with high market share on the one side, high market share on the other side, great credibility, and what have you. And we're pursuing that. We've gone to Wilkes-Barre, gone to Scranton, gone to Harrisburg, gone to Atlantic City. We really focus on all the really high-class, economically superb markets, and we try to take care of the sickest, because we figure if we can take care of the sickest and we can do it a little bit better than our competition, there's a huge amount of value and the question is, can we do it in the main line? Can we do it in Northern Virginia? Can we do it in California? Can we do it in various places in California? Can we do it can we do it in Singapore? And that's what we're trying right now, the generalizing and scaling experiment in XG. And I want to just finish by saying one thing. Consolidation is occurring both on the payer side, as you heard from Jack, but it's also an immense force now on the provider side. And we believe that it's stage one of a two-stage process. And stage one is still going to be the leverage game, who's got more clout in order to get the higher reimbursement per unit of work. But we believe that the forcing function, particularly as Medicare commits to 50% non-fee-for-service by 2018, and as Medicaid continues to expand, it's the most rapidly expanding public payer, that there will only be one sustainable business model to move forward, and that is to decrease the number of units and then to be able to redeploy that value. So I think that the second stage will be how many of those consolidations actually are shown to bring value to a cohort of patients or to a region. And innovation will thrive within this consolidated area because it'll focus, and we've worked with a number of great companies, some of whom are represented here. It'll focus on much more targeted, effective therapy, much more targeted, effective therapy. And that's what I think you're going to get paid for. Much more value proposition from the application of a device. Not selling a device to do more units of work at the highest possible reimbursement per unit, but how many times when you apply a device are you going to be able to get downstream benefit over some period of time for a patient with diabetes or with a predisposition to an infection or what have you. So I see this, I'm Pollyannish, otherwise I would not have had all the jobs that Roy summarized, but I think that there's a lot of good stuff that's going to happen out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. Well, every one of these talks has been entirely rational and makes sense, and they're all correct. But I'm going to ask Nancy Ann if now you've heard the various elements of healthcare discuss what's happening on their side. How does this? What would you suggest for the new president who will come in and handle the ACA going forward?
Well, I alluded to one piece of that, and hopefully the new president, it seems, would do well if he or she would sit down with this group, because they are all doing some very good things to move forward. But one thing is that we need to focus on still the work of getting everyone covered. There are 20 states that have not expanded Medicaid. Those states are leaving money on the table that could be helping the citizens, hospitals, providers in their states, the economic base of their states. So that needs to happen. I know firsthand that President Obama has done everything that he can to make that happen, but there are some states that just aren't going to do it until there's a new president, so there's an opportunity. Secondly, with respect to innovation, I think everyone up here has talked about the importance of innovation. Some of the ideas that we put forward in the Affordable Care Act to help bring down the rate of cost growth and to improve health care, we will be able to assess if they've worked. Others may not have worked as well. And we need new ideas. We need new ideas to continue to become, to strengthen our system, offer more efficient and more compassionate care. And I have no doubt, hearing my colleagues here and others last night, that those ideas will come. So they need to focus on that. And third, I'm very hopeful that we can move past the partisan divide. When people ask me, what one thing would you have changed about the Affordable Care Act? And there's dozens of things that I would change, but the main thing would be to have had it be bipartisan. We did everything we could to get Republican support. We did get, a modest amount of support in committees and moving to the floor, but when it came right down to it, it's a game of numbers. 60 votes in the Senate and 218 in the House, and those were all Democrats. We could not get Republicans to support it. And I think the law, I think the law is a strong foundation, but it would have been much stronger if we'd had, if it had been bipartisan. So I would hope that the next president will be able to break that divide.
That would be terrific. Well, I'm not going to make a lot of clever questions myself, because the audience has a lot more clever questions. And I'm going to take another 14 minutes because we can stop at 2 o'clock rather than the time that we had. And I would like to open the floor to questions. And please take a microphone and tell us who you are, and then your question. Can we have a mic? Okay, let's go back here. Can't hear you.
We're on. Okay. I have a question for Matt Herper from Forbes. I have a question for Ken and Peter about value-based pricing and not being like the pharma bro, as you mentioned. What I'm curious about is the justification that Martin Shkreli uses for what he is doing, which I think we'd all agree is not what other drug companies is doing, is that he is pricing a drug to its value. So if we are talking about pricing drugs to their value, how do you prevent bad actors from using that framework as opposed to whatever other framework you're going to use from saying, well, that's exactly what I'm doing. This is more valuable than you're saying in the system, and I'm going to raise the price. How does a value-based system prevent that?
Sure. All right. So a couple of things. First of all, to be clear, I was bringing this up in the context of describing the price hikes on generic drugs, which is one of the reasons that total spending on drugs has risen on much greater than spending on other aspects of healthcare. I think you're right that there's an intrinsic contradiction potentially with generic drugs if we take the view that those things that have already extracted quite a bit of profits, if you will, out of the system should continue to be able to be priced based on value. I think the generic drug industry is suffering from other sorts of problems, but these price hikes like that just are sort of don't make sense. But the other thing is that all of the justifications that Shkreli, if that's how you pronounce his name, pardon me if I got it wrong, all of his rationales were reverse engineered out of talking points from the industry. They had nothing to do with the decisions that were made. That was pure capitalization on monopoly power. So the issue is, I think, that we should try to codify, and this is why I have this drug abacus project, try and codify the domains of value, of benefit, of scientific novelty in a way that's reproducible and transparent, so that we can price drugs going forward based on that. And if we get to prices that are linked to drugs' value, the insurance system, and Ken is absolutely right, which doesn't work well now, it's sort of awkward, and the wrong tools are often applied to the wrong products. The insurance system needs to follow along so that a drug that's appropriately priced should not have some huge co-insurance with it. It should be a $5 copay or something like that. If a manufacturer charges to get to this generic issue, charges a value-based price, the exclusivity period should also acknowledge that, because that's all about when the money is recouped, so it should be lengthened. And if prices are higher, it should be shortened. And on that back end, the Turing pharmaceutical part, that's a different industry that actually does need to be thought about in terms of sort of a utility model, because there is an innovation happening there. It's a sort of a public good being produced through granted monopoly.
I agree. I would say, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. This is about actually expropriating value phraseology to do the opposite of it. This is taking advantage of a marketplace situation where you have only one generic. You have not spent any money on R&D, so it's not about R&D sustainability. It's really not about the fact that all of a sudden the drug actually has more value to patients than it used to have. It certainly is not about whether the drug suddenly has more value for the healthcare system. It's not about whether the drug suddenly meets an unmet medical need that it didn't meet before. It's not about whether or not you're providing more access because you're providing less access. And it's all about the fact that there's no competition temporarily in a situation. And so for us, as we think about value, we go through that framework. What is the benefit of a new medicine to patients? We think Keytruda has a benefit over and above anything that was there before. How does it help the healthcare system? How does it meet unmet medical need? And how do we now price it in a way that balances our need to be sustainable as an R&D-based company, yet provides patient access? So to me, it's really about that balance that we're striving for as an industry.
Yeah, and I guess the best example of long-term benefits on the cost side are what happened to the cost of AIDS and HIV infection, when we had initially had no drugs and didn't know what it was about, and everybody died. So you had them in hospitals with projection of building all kinds of new hospitals to handle the oncoming epidemic. And then the new drugs started to flow based on research in universities, basic research, applied research in industry, one new drug after another, and now people go back to work. The drugs, and people, by the way, complained about prices, but the value was incredible. And so this is the dream, of course, of people in the pharmaceutical biotechnology industry.
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, Roy, first of all, whenever there's an aberration, I mean, there's always a tendency to regulate to that aberration, and more often than not, that does a huge amount of damage to all of us. So that's number one. Number two, I think the market will take care of this issue. I'm absolutely certain of that. Number three, I think if we look at the trade-offs in a closed system, it's a pretty large closed system now. It's not like you guys, but $6 billion seems like a lot to me. But in a fairly large closed system, I would just be able to justify our increased pharma spend in a New York minute compared to the 20 to 25% decrease in hospitalization. Now, it's not an absolute. I mean, there are obviously things on the margin that don't figure. But in a closed system, you can make that kind of value judgment in a much more rational way.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. We'll take one consecutively.
Frank Bamberg, I'm a layman. Here's my question. The supply of medical staff. I understand that many doctors don't want, for financial reasons, they don't want to touch Medicare and definitely not Medicaid. Also, that there's a tremendous decline in the number of medical students who go in general practice, maybe 20%. What can be done to help to provide the staff which is being paid for by the new insurance?
Thank you. Jack, would you take that?
Sure, a couple of data points. There is indeed, sir, a very significant and increasing shortage of primary care providers in the country, aggravated in a paradoxical way by the fact that we're now insuring more people who need primary care. One of the solutions to that is probably related to advanced practice nurses who have been shown unquestionably to be able to provide core primary care services with as much quality and safety and at lower cost than primary care trained physicians. There are now about 18 states that permit that. This is a state decision, not a federal decision, and there are obviously forces in organized, so-called, euphemistically called organized medicine, which are threatened by that. So that's a sort of trench warfare, day by day, state by state issue. The proportion or the number of physicians who do not accept Medicare is vastly exaggerated. Ms. DeParle ran Medicare. That wasn't mentioned, but that was one of the smaller jobs she had along the way, so she can respond to this. But she ran Medicare and Medicaid for the United States, and I'll let her respond. Nancy?
Well, and you and I served on MedPAC together, and every year we scrutinize the data, and the number is 99 or
99%
take
of
Medicare.
and the
Now,
AMA
they may not
always says if Medicare does this, doctors will flee. But the fact is they don't flee, except on Park Avenue, and no hospitals flee because you basically can't run a hospital in the United States without Medicare revenues. It's a huge part of your revenues.
Michael Rosenblatt at Merck, and first of all, I want to congratulate the panel. I thought the discussion was absolutely outstanding. I have a question for Dr. Bach. I've been the president of an academic medical center in Boston, and now I'm a chief medical officer, and I've come to learn that the price of a drug experienced by the patient is very different than the price when it leaves the door of the pharmaceutical company, and that there are markups by academic medical centers that often are substantial, sometimes even several-fold. Nobody on the panel has mentioned that at all, and I'm wondering what you think of that practice and its contribution to pricing.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. I alluded to it a little bit in my reference to 340B, which is a hospital phenomenon. So a couple things. One is the prices that we track, the prices I was talking about, the 100-fold price increase in cancer drugs. Those are, I've always taken the view that it's the public's payment level or reimbursement from Medicare and Part D, the charged against benefit portion, which is the price. It's for sure, as you've mentioned, not the price received by the manufacturer. There are numerous intermediaries, right, and PBMs and purchasing collaboratives and other things who take a piece as it goes from the company to the person who pays for it. But I've always taken the view that if we use Medicare reimbursement rates on physician-infused drugs and Part D drug benefit structure from Plan Finder, that at least gives us a reasonable lens to look over time. The markup, no, it's an important issue. As I mentioned, I believe that to get to a value-based system, we need indication-specific pricing, which means disintermediating the prescribers, which includes hospitals. Right? And on the 340B side, what's happened, this is a drug discount program which provides very large discounts to hospitals that take care of the poor, but some other categories as well. They get up to 50% discounts, pass on none of those to patients or insurers or Medicare. So those hospitals are capitalizing, and as you said, even without that, United Healthcare said if the average markup on a physician-infused drug in the doc office was about 22%, it's about 140% in hospitals. So that's a lot of extra money going for that, and in some cases through consolidation, you have a hospital will buy a clinic, all they do is ship them their stationery, and they get to mark up their private insurance rates. I don't mean to misstate it. They actually don't have to ship the stationery to do that. So, but I mean, it's really not organizationally important, but they move them on to different contracts. So that is a serious defect, and as I mentioned, studies of 340B hospitals have shown, and they're not unique, but you have this moment where the reimbursement changed, which shows that they, at that time, will then shift to higher priced drugs, and that's all about margin. So that is another defect in the system, and it's another form of deadweight loss, if you will, which is why I'd like to sort of peel it back one level so we can manage drugs based on their indication and have a sort of a place where we don't have providers saying, I'll make money on this, I won't make money on that, and somehow influencing even subtly a decision that should be completely focused on the patient.
Thanks, Peter. Last question, because we're running out of time.
Thanks, Roy. Also, Ron Cohen, I'm CEO of Accorda Therapeutics and also the current chair of the board of the Biotech Industry Organization, BIO. I also want to commend the panel for an outstanding discussion and maybe circle back in a more holistic way on some of the comments different panelists made. But I'm very concerned that in the current environment, there is a laser focus on one sector of the healthcare system, and that's the biopharmaceutical system. And it's reached a fever pitch, if you will, every single day. There's an article or a video or some expose in the media about something in the industry. And what I don't see is a sense of balance across the entire healthcare system. So at this time, pharmaceuticals are still about 10, maybe 10 to 13% of the overall healthcare dollar. Hospitals alone are 30%, right? Some of the things that Michael was just talking about, and I had mentioned to Dr. Bach earlier, I actually had a personal testimonial from a physician in the industry who went to Sloan Kettering recently, having bought out of pocket a cancer drug for his mother because it was off-label and not paid for by insurance, $5,000 for a dose. And he asked Memorial Sloan Kettering to please infuse that. And they said, sure, we'll be delighted to for $30,000. Right. And so they went eventually, and they went to NYU, and that was $20,000, a bargain. So they went to a private infusion center, and they got the infusion for $500. You have wildly varying prices for surgery, right? You have cabbages, for example, coronary bypass, anywhere from $60,000 to $120,000 per procedure. And the other piece that isn't being talked about is insurance companies are not generally asking patients to take 20 or 30% of that cost on themselves, but they do routinely ask them to take 20 to 30% of a specialty drug cost. So if you look at the entire system, there just are disequilibria, if you will, across the entire system. And my concern is that by focusing only on biopharmaceuticals, we're actually risking killing the one part of the industry or retarding the one part of the industry that ultimately can save costs with innovation.
I think that's a perfect way to end our panel.
No way. That's a predictable applause.
I want to thank our panelists. I think the discussions were terrific, and I look forward to seeing them again next year. So thank you all.